To chapter 9 of the NASM CPT certification prep. This is one of the courses or one of the presentations that we don't cover during one of my normal class time periods. So I'm just going to do this off of class time. And this is going to be more for everybody because we have a dedicated nutrition program that we have with my university. So this here is a little bit secondary because our students normally take that. So with that, we're still going to roll through this, try to get you as much nutrition information as you can possibly get. So run through everything here as best as possible. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to my Instagram, to my just the YouTube page itself, or with my email, which are all linked inside of the video as well. So let's do it. So obviously nutrition, meaning that we're just trying to get the food and the food products that we need to help with obviously offsetting the issues that come with exercise. All right. So we need to rebuild our energy or make sure we have enough energy to support our exercise or our strength or our any athletic ability, whatever it might be. Cellular processes, and with those cells, we want to talk about growth, repair, maintenance of not just cells, but also your tissues, your reproduction, your digestive, and your breathing. All of these things are key, obviously, for anybody along the continuum of performance. All right, so we're talking about from a rehab person all the way up to your elite athletes. All right, everybody here, whether you're trying to change body comp, whether you're trying to, well, with body comp, that's usually body fat. Now, we're talking also about increasing lean muscle mass. We're talking about just making the change, whether we want to grow or we want to lean out, whatever it might be. Or it might just be to maintain where you're normally at. All right. So understanding our basic nutrition principles is going to be key. This will help you to understand it. Now, remember, there is a fine line between what you can and what you cannot do. And so we got to be very, very careful of that. We need to make sure that we're paying attention to a lot of things that we can do. So you have to make sure you find out what your abilities are in terms of not crossing over into the dietetic realm. So just remember that. We can give advice, but typically anything that revolves around like a nutrition plan, we start blurring those lines. So we got to be very careful. All right, and this is exactly what we're going to. We need to be aware of where we fall on this continuum. And really, looking at, I'm going to keep this up here for a second, but I want you to read through each of these and understand that these are the roles that are out there in terms of even if you wanted to go beyond just your training, if you want to go beyond whatever schooling you might have, this would be, if you want to go into a nutrition background, this is really critical for that. All right. But these are other certifications. These are other licensures, because remember, a licensure means that you are truly a dietitian. And that means that you can help people, especially with chronic diseases, and that's usually more clinical or medical. So just be aware. So these are up here for you to take a look at, and we'll move on from here. But understand, your scope of practice is not this, okay? You need to be aware as a trainer that you are held into a little bit of more of a box, but you need to be aware that you can provide really pertinent information to your people so that they understand more about nutrition. And then if they needed a diet plan or if they needed help in terms of the planning process, you can either outsource that or, find somebody who is certified or licensed that can do that. So there's your can and cannots. I'm not going to get into the bigs of those, but understand you can is on the left, you cannot is on the right. So anything you see there, prescribe, write, advise against recommendations of a healthcare professional. You got to be very careful of that. You cannot provide detailed nutrition plans for athletes who are participating in extreme things like Ironmans or ultra marathons. All right, so you got to be paying attention to these in particular because you don't want to go outside of your scope of practice. Follow along with these, but again, a lot of the stuff on the left is a lot more basic information. But remember, basic nutrition guidelines. You're not developing a plan. Okay, you're not developing a meal plan for them. So when it comes to what do we got to do here, in terms of nutritional information, All right, like it says here on the left-hand side, fitness professionals must distinguish and differentiate between false or misleading nutrition claims and credible and valid nutrition information. There is a lot of false information. I don't want to call it false. A lot of leading information, a lot of things that aren't backed by science and backed by being proven in the field. I know we use the term bro science, but bro science has a lot of validity when it comes to some of the things that people do, but we got to be very careful to avoid some of that stuff as well. So it's always that fine line. So credible nutrition information is rooted in and supported by empirical science, meaning that you are trying to find the information that you're searching for. Okay, be careful of things like it says on the internet, on social media. If you're an avid TikTok user, I can't make any other noise besides that. That gets me kind of scared because you see things that are out there and it makes you question. All right, so what are we looking for? Peer-reviewed articles. We're looking for things like, if you go onto like Harvard's webpage, if it's like .gov.edu, anything that seems reputable, and then do a little bit more research with it. Find out what the qualifications are for the people that are there. And obviously make sure that it's definitely backed by science. So peer-reviewed research is key. Me personally, I'm a big advocate of the JISSN, which is the Journal of the International Sports Science, Sports Nutrition. They are really, really important in terms of open access, meaning you don't have to pay for the articles. And a lot of the stuff that they have is amazing for us in the fitness community. There are some other aspects to it there, but a lot of the stuff that we would need, you could find a lot of nutritional based, especially position stands from them. But one thing I see here, the one that's the farthest over to the right where it says personal testimonials are not necessarily supported by research. Just because somebody is claiming something and saying that it might have worked for them, it doesn't mean that it's got enough evidence to back it up. So just be aware. So let's dive in. Macro and micro. All right. Carbs, fats, proteins, micros, vitamins, and minerals. Now, understand that you might see things here like alcohol. Alcohol is still considered a caloric dense, meaning that it has this ability to this caloric dense component here where it has all the calories, but there's no nutritional value to them. So when we talk about empty calories, that's kind of what we're saying. All right. But understand, what is it for test taking purposes? Proteins, they contain 4 calories for every gram. So if you're eating, just say you're a person who eats 30 grams of protein, okay, you would take those 4 calories per gram and multiply it by the amount of grams. So 4 times 30 equals 120. 4, carbs are 4, fats, lipids are 9. When they talk about calorie dense food again versus nutrient dense food, carbohydrates can be very nutrient dense if it's obviously any healthy options here we're talking about, but proteins and carbs are very nutrient dense, meaning they contain a lot of other things that we need for ourselves. Fats typically, not all the time, fats typically are more calorie dense, meaning they contain more calories per gram. So if you have a fat that say has 20 grams of fat in it, it times 9 calories per gram is 180 calories. So when you look at your nutrition labels, that's how the breakdown occurs. But remember, lipids contain more calories, may not be the most nutritious. On the left-hand side, your micros, vitamins and minerals, those do not contain calories. They are inserted into they're not inserted. They're either readily available inside of the food, or they may be inserted depending upon what the food item might be. But particularly vitamins and minerals are normally naturally found in those ingredients, okay? So there's your protein. Your basic building blocks are what we call amino acids. They are what we see now. If you look over here, if you follow my mouse, you can see carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and a nitrogen. That's what makes them different than a carb and a fat, is that they contain nitrogen. So when we talk about something called nitrogen balance and being in a positive nitrogen balance, that means that we are able to grow, we're able to gain muscle. When we start getting into that negative nitrogen balance, that's when we start to lose that muscle mass that we might once have had. All right. So we understand that if we look on the left, amino acids make up peptides, and these peptides strung together make up the full protein. All right. So typically a protein is what we would call a polypeptide, and that means that it's multiple peptides together that make the protein. Now on the bottom there, definitely pay attention to the 20 total amino acids, 9 and 11. Why? Because 20 of them make up our amino acid base that we have. 9 of them are what we call essential. Now remember this term, because if you're taking the test and it comes down to this and you want to know your right answer, if it says if it says there might be 9 blank amino acids, either non-essential or essential, you're going to say there's 9 essential. Why? Essential means it's essential for you to eat, meaning that you have to eat those so that you can obtain them, and because your body doesn't naturally make them. There's 11 non-essential amino acids which our body actually makes, and it's actually they're synthesized within our system, and they're always being resynthesized to keep up on them, unless of course they break down enough where they're sent out as waste byproduct. Okay, so 9 essential EAAs and 11 non-essential. So we have to make sure when we're eating protein, we want to always have the 9 essentials, and usually the 11 non-essentials. The 9 essential is what we need to eat. The 11 non-essentials are what we would have in our system. But if we eat them, it's not going to be a problem as long as we don't overeat, obviously. But 11 non-essential means that we get them in our diet. They're not necessarily 100% needed in most cases, but we know that sometimes having more of them can help during certain situations. Especially for an example, you might have heard of the supplement glutamine. Glutamine is actually what helps people who are burn victims. So sometimes we might want to increase the amount of glutamine, which is an amino acid, and that amino acid can help to basically rejuvenate the skin. So that's just one example of that. So here's your essentials versus your non-essential. Now, if you look on the left side with the little triangles there next to them, leucine, isoleucine, and valine, those are what we call BCAAs. I'm sure you heard that before, branch chain amino acids. Those are the ones that we really rely on a lot for strength purposes, for basically being able to do normal rebuilding of our cells, of rebuilding of our protein base with them. And those are usually really important for us. Now, there is some mixed research on whether BCAAs, the supplement, are a positive or they really don't do much for you. But understand that left side, that essential side, all of those, we need to eat those. I'm sure you've seen tryptophan. You know tryptophan from turkey. It's the one that makes you feel kind of sleepy. So that's just another example of that. Lysine, phenylalanine. All of those are needed in our bodies. All right, we need to eat those to get them inside. The ones in the middle, the non-essentials, those are what we again have circulating as alanine. You might have heard that from beta alanine, which makes you feel kind of like itchy and scratchy when you take it. But alanine is a component of that. Arginine is naturally circulating. All right, so and then going down the list there. There's a lot of other non-essentials. We don't need to get into each one of them, but understand there are 9 and 11. All right. If it says, maybe you might see on a test question like arginine, arginine is a blank amino acid, you would put non-essential. All right. Now it says conditionally essential, so you got to be very careful. It just depends on how it's worded, but normally it's a non-essential. That's one of the first times I've actually ever seen organization list anything as conditionally essential. But understand that arginine, glutamine, and histidine, they are important for our system. Sometimes we need more of that in our body. Arginine especially, because arginine is what we call a vasodilator, and it helps to open up the blood vessels. So that's just an example there. So again, dietary protein, there's your sources. There's complete proteins. Complete protein means contains all 9 essential amino acids. Incomplete proteins are those on the right-hand side of that chart, and those would be where you would have to combine some of them, which we call mutual supplementation. We would maybe mix, I'm sure, a piece of whole grain bread with peanut butter. That would be an example of what we call mutual supplementation, where we get the peanuts that have some proteins. We have the grain of the multigrain bread, and put those together, and that makes a complete protein, but you have to eat two different options. Whereas if you have meat, poultry, seafood, eggs, dairy, soy or hemp, they're going to contain all the EAAs. All right. So just be aware that you need to know the difference between the two of those, complete and incomplete. Now, in terms of your protein quality, just understand that when we talk about the profiles of these, we have low and high biological values. So if you see low biological values, usually incomplete proteins are those that are missing essential. Those are some that are missing some of those essential amino acids, whereas high biological value are those that contain all, that are more like complete proteins that could contain the essential amino acids. So what is that saying for those, like on the bottom there where it says plant-based diets? For those individuals who are on plant-based diets, they're looking at a lot more foods that contain low biological values. So plant-based, those who are some variation of vegan, all of those make a difference in terms of your biological value. What are we looking for? More of those high biological, because they contain all the essential amino acids. All right. And that's really critical for that. So the higher the biological value, the more protein you're going to get after digestion. And that's really important for when it gets to the small intestines to be absorbed. All right. So there's your digestion, absorption, and utilization. You can see here with protein, it gets into the mouth, into the stomach where it starts to break down the food you ate into basically smaller peptide chains, so it's easier to pass through into the small intestines. And then basically what happens is inside of the small intestines, you have what we call protease, which is an enzyme that helps break down those peptide chains into single amino acids, so it makes it easier to get into the bloodstream and go to the liver, where it'll eventually end up in the circulation of the whole body. All right, there's a lot of stuff on the left, but if you listen to my words there, it just breaks everything down more simplistically so that you can see mouth, stomach, small intestines, and talks about the veins, but really we're saying it gets to the small intestines, to the bloodstream, to the liver, where it then from there decides, okay, what are we going to do with it? And then it sends it out into the circulation of the body. The remaining amount will usually, obviously for eating the right amount of food, it will then be waste byproduct if, the body feels like it doesn't need it. Okay? But the liver is usually the quarterback, I guess you would say. They're basically the quarterback to say, this is where I want this to go, and as it goes to the circulation, it's going to know where to send it. All right. Now, as for energy, proteins are not really high in energy in terms of providing energy unless it's like starvation, and if you're doing like really long, like ultra marathon, Ironman competitions, where when you run through all of your carbs and fats, you kind of have nothing left but protein. All right. Now, if you look here, a lot of times what can happen at second bullet point, if insufficient calories are consumed, then dietary protein or bodily tissue protein, meaning muscle, may be used to meet energy needs. So what happens is muscle will break down, and when it breaks down, it will release the amino acids that are involved, aspects like alanine and glutamine, that will go to the liver, which will basically create what we call gluconeogenesis, or you're going to create glucose, a form of carbohydrate, really, that will supply the body with energy from the breakdown and conversion of alanine and glutamine to glucose within the liver. All right, and that's a whole process that's undertaken, because under duress or under starvation, it might have to happen. So we got to make sure adequate caloric intake, adequate protein intake, and there you go. By meeting your needs of what your body is made up of, or what you're trying to achieve in terms of your body, will be very important, especially if you're trying to keep or build muscle. So if you're not eating enough calories and you're wondering why you're not growing per se, it's probably a potential that you're not getting enough calories, and particularly not enough calories from protein as well. So that's always a concern there. So dietary needs, normally we talk about a non-exercising need, what we say is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So if you look down at the bottom, if you see where it gives you kind of like the breakdown of everything, that's more for determining how much you need if you were this individual right here. Now that person is someone who needs 1900 calories daily. That's a little bit different than the top. On the top, what we're saying there is that if you are a non-exerciser, you just say that you got, the way that we do that though is we have to make sure we convert our pounds that we weigh into kilograms. So if you weigh 220 pounds, is always a really easy one. So there's 2.2 pounds for every kilo that's there. So if you're 220 pounds and it's 2.2 pounds per kilo, that means you're 100 kilograms. That's how much you weigh. So you would take 100 kilograms times that by 0.8, and that would be 80. So you need 80 grams for a person. Now that they also give you the example there of a 70 kilogram person, you multiply that number by 0.8 and it gives you that person needs 56 grams daily. Now that's a non-exerciser. A little bit low on the spectrum, probably something that you're like, wow, that's really low than what I've ever been told. So on another scale, what we could do is that individuals should be eating about 10 to 35% of their calories from protein based on your AMDRs, acceptable macronutrient distribution range, which was developed for all macronutrients. 10 to 35%. So like it says here, if you figured out how many calories you needed, you would multiply 1900 by 0.1 and then 1900 by 0.35. And then you take those two numbers. Now remember, if we go back to this little chart right here, protein, there's 4 calories per gram. Remember that from before. So that individual right here, you take 190 and 665 and divide them by 4 calories to get your grams, and that person technically, depending upon who they are, would need 48 grams to 166 grams of protein daily. Now that's obviously dependent on their goal. Okay, that's dependent upon who they are as an individual, what they're trying to achieve. So it can get protein dietary needs get very tricky, but understand for testing you want to know this information here and basically what we just discussed. So exercise and anabolic needs, you can see here now, and I would definitely make sure you know this chart. A strength and resistance trained athlete does not need 0.8 grams per kilogram. Remember, we go back here, we look at that second bullet point, 0.8 grams. No, a strength athlete needs more protein. They're saying along the lines of 1.6 to 1.7 grams per kilogram. So if we went back to that individual over here, if they weighed 70 kilograms in this example, we would multiply 70 by 1.6 and 1.7, and that would give us some sort of idea as to what they would need for their protein totals. Endurance athletes, you can see, are a little bit different, and then most exercising individuals slightly varied. Now, you can see there that goes 1.4 to 2.0. Well, 2.0, really, that's more bodybuilderish. If you're really trying to pack on some muscle, that's usually what we talk about there. So it depends on who you are. Are you an endurance athlete? Are you a strength athlete? Are you an exerciser? Or are you someone who doesn't work out? Well, now we can see here that there's a wide variety, and we have to be aware of that, even for ourselves. So, in terms of our negative energy balance, okay, if you're trying to, and what we mean by negative, if you're trying to lose weight, okay, if you're trying to lose weight, we have to be aware that we're going to have to really cut some calories out. But the problem is, you need to offset your negative energy balance, and this is why this makes sense for the protein area that we're in. That's why it's kind of like, whoa, why are we talking about calories now? Well, no. If you're trying to cut calories, you need to make sure that your protein requirements go up, okay? Protein needs to go up to offset the fact that when you lose weight, you can potentially lose muscle mass. So we want to try to help diminish that potentially if possible, all right? Or at least diminish the total amount of muscle we lose. All right, so we have to be aware of that, okay? So one of the things that we have to understand is that protein also has what we call a high thermic effect of food, meaning that it takes a lot more to burn. It takes, our body burns more calories trying to digest protein. So therefore, that also helps with weight loss as well, hence why we want to have a higher protein diet. So, what are some considerations and concerns? Client questions you might get: how much protein is too much? Is there a danger? Well, there really isn't a danger, as you saw in the material, but usually if you have any kidney disorders, that's usually when we start to be very careful of how much protein you get. All right. Now, there are some side effects, but again, that's if you're starting to get to those higher protein diets. But again, increased excretion of calcium, that's long term. That doesn't happen right away. And that's usually, again, a severely high amount. All right. And then increased risk of kidney stones or gout. Well, that's because if you start having a high protein diet for way too long and you're excreting too much calcium, those calcium deposits will end up in your kidneys. Or gout, meaning it's like little crystallizations of uric acid that are released from your kidneys. And that can cause problems in your joints, where kidney stones, they're calcium deposits in your kidneys. And that I heard I've never had one, but I've heard they're extremely painful. I'm sure you've probably heard the same thing. Now, leaving protein, let's get into our carbs. Our carbohydrates are those, now if we remember from protein, we said carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Now notice carbohydrates only contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so not nitrogen. So nitrogen only is contained inside of protein. Now, there are simple and complex carbs. There's glycogen and there's fiber. Okay, each of those has their own structure, right? But particularly our carbohydrate in general structure: mono, di, and polysaccharides. Okay, now glucose is a little guy. It's one molecule of carbohydrate. Glucose. Fructose is also one single saccharide. And galactose. All of those are found in exactly where it says: fruit, or table sugar, or dairy. All right. Now, when you take glucose, fructose, and galactose and add glucose to them, you're going to have glucose plus fructose, right? Fructose meaning the fruit sugar. That's going to make so it's going to make sucrose. All right. So glucose plus fructose equals sucrose. Glucose plus glucose equals maltose. Okay. And glucose plus galactose equals lactose. And I'm sure you've heard that before. So if you ever heard of somebody who has lactose intolerance, that means they don't have the right enzymes to break down lactose. All right. And that just means that lactose is a galactose molecule, which is from milk and dairy, mixed with a glucose molecule that makes a lactose. So it's a two-strand chain, or not a strand, it's two saccharides connected together that make one, and that's a disaccharide. Now, polysaccharides are those that are more than two, all right? Because remember, di is two together, poly is multiple. So you have your starches, okay, things that are, your examples are your grains, potatoes, fruits, veggies, nuts, and seeds. Glycogen, which is stored inside of our liver and inside of our muscle. And then fiber, which typically is found inside of plants, all right, that is broken down so that we can digest food better, okay? And then inside of that fiber, you have soluble and insoluble, okay? So there's your polysaccharides, there's your soluble fiber and your insoluble fiber, which we were talking about before. Dietary needs: 25 to 28 grams for women, 30 to 34 for men, all right? And that's for people that are 19 to 50 years old. So with soluble and insoluble fiber, it's really important that you have a combination of both, all right? One dissolves in water, the other one does not. Soluble does, insoluble doesn't. And really, the main thing to understand about them is that soluble fiber helps you feel full, helps with lowering of cholesterol, helps with cardiovascular disease risk, and it helps with just making sure that your gut, your gastrointestinal tract is healthy. Whereas insoluble fiber is usually the one that helps you make you feel full, but it's also the one, insoluble fiber is the one that makes you feel the way you do, that helps you with moving stool or poop through your system. Okay, and that's really the most important part about insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber helps with making things cleaner, I guess you would say. All right, and then there's your food sources as well. So with the digestive part, actually, inside of the mouth is where you start to break down your carbohydrates. We have what's called salivary amylase, which is found in your mouth. That begins to start breaking down carbohydrates right away. All right, but only a little amount, only a little bit amount. Then from there, inside of the stomach, it will start to kind of not really break down, but just kind of start that mixing and churning of carbohydrates. And then once it gets into the small intestines, that's where, again, you go from the food stuff that has been slightly broken down into those single monosaccharides that then get absorbed and then sent out to the rest of the body. Okay. Now, typically they'll end up going to the liver and then off to wherever else they have to go. Now, the liver will keep some of that and store it as what we called glycogen before. So some glucose that comes in will be left to get converted into what we call glycogen. All right. Excess, too much of it, we can actually start to store it as fat, but it takes a lot. It takes a lot more than what we think. If we overate one day, it doesn't mean that those carbohydrates are going to be stored as fat. It takes a lot for it to be in one day. But understand that again, continual excess carbohydrates can get converted to fat. So with glucose, meaning, stored glycogen that gets broken down and then set off as glucose, or what's found in the blood, because we can find glucose in the blood. If we have too much of it in the blood, it can have a problem with our blood sugar. That's usually what we worry about with diabetics. So again, we have to make sure we're paying attention to, can we have high GI foods? Sure we can. No one says that we can't. And by GI, we're referring to GI meaning glycemic index foods. But, no one says we can't have high GI foods. They just have to be at the right times. And normally those high GI foods can be really important after a workout because our body wants to suck them up really quick and it wants to put them into where they got to be. All right. Low and medium GI foods, they can be really important for other times throughout the day, but just be aware that too much of it is still going to raise your blood sugar too much. And then if it's prolonged, that's where we can start leading that into diabetes. Then because of the fact that we have to rely on insulin to help bring that blood sugar down. So calling upon insulin too much can make us what we call insulin resistant, where we want to be insulin sensitive. Okay. So what are we saying here? If we have that person, again, and we'll talk about the bottom part first, the AMGR. Remember we said 10 to 35% for protein, 45 to 65% of our calories can come from carbohydrates. All right. Now the conversion is up on the top like we did last time. So we're saying that same person who had a 1900 calorie diet would need 214 to 309 grams of carbs throughout the day. Now, if you're somebody who is an athlete, that's where the chart comes in down here. So depending upon what level of intensity you train at will determine how many grams per kilogram, kind of like with protein. So you can see here where we're not taking exact numbers per se, but we're looking at the recommendations for carbs per day, adding those to our protein per day, adding those two together, and then filling in the rest in with fat is really what we like to say. But again, we have to be within a certain number of calories as well. So, before, during, and after exercise, carbs consumed prior to intense and long duration exercise can help with glycogen storage and help you become depleted overnight, okay, during your overnight fast to make sure we have enough in our systems. So we have to make sure we get enough carb. That's why when you hear people talk about how they do like a carb load the night before just to get as many in, that's because they're trying to avoid when their body goes into the overnight fast, you're still going to burn some carbs out of your system, but we want to try to avoid that as much as possible. All right. During activity that lasts for longer than an hour, that can help us with maintaining our good blood glucose levels so we don't become dizzy and pass out or have to slow down. And then it'll help us with our muscles and also with our glycogen stores inside of our muscles so that they don't become depleted too soon. because we want to keep prolong muscle glycogen as much as possible, so the storage of glucose inside of the muscle. After exercise, we definitely need to make sure we have carbs and protein that can help with protein synthesis, so helping to build muscle back up, recovery, and then glycogen replenishment. There is so much research that has been done about that, on whether you should have protein only, carbohydrates only, or protein and carbohydrates. And majority of research indicates that it's a transport issue. Carbs and proteins help to become transported faster when they're put together. So it's really important that you have a protein, carbohydrate, either drink or food, whatever you feel comfortable with. But we want to make sure that if a person works out a couple times, like if you're doing 2 days, 3 days, whatever it might be, understand that you're going to have to work with them on how to make sure they can get through proper nutrition, and make sure they're working with somebody else too to make sure they're getting the right nutrients, especially when they have to recover in between bouts. That's really important as well. Lastly is your fats, all right, also known as lipids. All right, and what lipids are usually made up, what they're comprised of is what we call triglycerides, which that's part of being a fat. So I know triglycerides are a really negative name, but that's really what a fat is made up of, is a triglyceride, phospholipids, and sterols. Right? All of them are different types, and each one of them has a different purpose, and you can see all your purposes there. So take a look at them and make sure you understand what their structures are, where they're found, what types of foods they're found in, because phospholipids are really important for cells. Sterols, cholesterol is really important too for making sure we have a good balance between HDLs and LDLs. All right, and then triglycerides are important because those are what we use for energy sources, and some individuals may need a little bit more fat in their diet than others, because especially for calorie purposes. But we're looking at high quality, all natural products that we can get from, not from processed foods that would make it more not of a quality that we were looking for. There's your structures. Okay, so depending upon what kind of fat you're having, you have mono unsaturated, you have polyunsaturated, and then you have what we call saturated and trans fat. Now, saturated, if you look at that structure there on the left, if you notice that every C has carbon, has a hydrogen around it, that means it's saturated. Saturated fats are, this is where people freak out. Saturated fats are necessary for us, because if we didn't have saturated fat, unless you're a vegan, this is where it gets tricky. And I'm not talking down on anybody who's a vegan. I don't want anybody to think that. But if you're a person who eats animal products, you're going to have high quality protein, but you also have to be careful on how much saturated fat is in there, because saturated fat comes from animals. All right. Obviously there's a couple other like plant sources, but typically it's coconut oil and palm oil, but normally saturated fats come from animal products, and which includes dairy. Unsaturated, you can see there, it means that there is typically one area or multiple areas that don't have a hydrogen connected, and that's where we talk about mono unsaturated or polyunsaturated fats. Mono unsaturated means that there's one area that doesn't have a hydrogen, and that's the one you see down below, polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, because there's one area that has a carbon double bond, that's the two double lines, and you're missing a hydrogen on each. Now, if it's polyunsaturated, it means that happens more than once on different areas of that chain. Okay? And then one of the things that happens is if you wanted to take extra hydrogens and put them into the saturated fat, like, so if I were to say, okay, I have some hydrogen, I'm going to put a couple extra hydrogen that can connect to the carbons, that's what we call trans fats. That's, I guess a good way to put it is hypersaturated, if you wanted to call it that. But that's where we add in more to basically take an oil and make it into a solid in a way. All right. But we got to be very, very careful by doing that, by making what we call hydrogenated. We got to be careful with that, because that's when we start getting into the unhealthy products. All right. Now, depending upon If it's all natural trans fat, that's a little bit different, because if it comes from like an animal or from dairy, which obviously comes from an animal as well, it really depends. But if it's artificially made, like in a lab, that's scarier, because that's going to be what's going to create more of a effort toward cardiovascular disease in the long term. Okay, and we don't want that to happen. Fats, little different. Start to, as we start chewing, we start breaking down the food. All right, slight breakdown of fats in the mouth as well. Very little, but not a lot. The stomach, little bit of fat digestion there, but very little as well. But majority of it happens inside of our small intestines. All right, where we basically break our triglycerides down into what we call monoglycerides and what we call free fatty acids, and those what get uptaked into the blood, and then from there it gets sent out to where it's got to go. All right, cells need fat, organs need fat, muscles need fat, but one of the things that doesn't need fat is adipose tissue, because that's already stored fat as it is. So we don't want to have too much fat increase in a way. We want to avoid that as much as possible, because if we're adding more fat to the and creating a larger size of the adipose cell, then we're basically going to create a more amount of stored fat that we don't want to have, and it's going to be harder to break that down. So be very, very careful of that. So dietary needs, 20 to 35%. So let's go back to 10 to 35% for proteins, 45 to 65% for carbs, 20 to 35% for fats. Basically here, as long as we know where we're at in terms of our carb and fat numbers, we can fill in the rest of our caloric intake with fat. Okay? But where do we want to get them from? Look at the bottom. Olives, olive oil, nuts, seeds, fatty fish, all of those things. So having healthy fats is really important, and it will help us to maintain a lot of times people don't realize, but having the right amount of fats and the right amount of cholesterol can help with hormonal balance, which can help or hinder you depending upon what levels you go to. Also understand that having the right amount of fats will give us the proper omega-3s and 6s that we need. A lot of times our systems, depending upon how we purchase food or anything like that, it's really critical that we realize that omega-3s are usually the under-eaten, so we got to pay attention to foods that are omega-3 heavier, because a lot of the other foods that we have in our system contain omega-6s. And then we get into our micros, so our vitamins and minerals. Okay, they are not energy sources, they don't have any calories, but they are really important for all things metabolism and a lot of all things cell. Okay, so all minerals and vitamins are what we call essential. Remember, you have to get them through your diet, except for vitamin D, niacin, and biotin. All of those our body makes or converts. Like for vitamin D, for example, sunlight can be converted on the skin to create vitamin D. All right. So ultimately, we have to be very careful, because do we need to take supplements for this? That's where the kind of the guideline becomes skewed, because does somebody need supplements? Does another person not need it? So it just depends. Okay. So here's what we would call our fat soluble vitamins, those that do not get broken down by water. Okay. So fat soluble, these also can be really important to know about, because if you have too much of them, like if you hyper supplement with these, if you go overboard with your supplements, you can actually get sick. And I don't want to say that you could die, but you can get into some very high illness levels by consuming too much. Okay, so following the recommendations of following the recommendations that you're supposed to have for everyday usage is going to be critical in that. So there's your A, your D, and your E and your K. So ADIC, okay, A, D, E, and K. All of them have specific roles there that you can see. So you can obviously pause this and look at those. And then there's all your sources on the right. Not going to go through them because you can see them here. And then That's something that you definitely can pay attention to. Look at it and know, like, okay, am I getting enough E? You go into MyFitnessPal, plug in your food, it might show that you're deficient on 4 straight weeks for vitamin K. Well, that could be a blood clotting effect later on if we don't do that. So just be aware of your micronutrient, amounts. The other one, water soluble, is vitamin C and all of the B vitamins. Now, there's only 2 right here, but we're going to go into the next page. So again, you can pause it, look at it, see where you get your stuff from. But there's C, thiamine, which is B1, riboflavin, which is B2, and then we're going to go to the next page. Niacin's B3, pyridoxine is B6, folate, cobalamin, biotin, pantothenic acid, all of those. Vitamin B12, remember, people say, oh, vitamin B12 gives me energy. Well, it gives me energy because look at the first thing it does. It helps with creating energy metabolism, meaning breaking your food down for energy. So that's why it's not the B12 that's creating the energy. It's the fact that B12 enhances the usage of carbs, fats, and proteins to be used for energy and makes you feel more comfortable. Or not more comfortable, makes you feel more ready to go in terms of your energy amount. Minerals, all right, there's 2 different categories, major and trace, or sometimes they might be called micro, depending upon where you read it. But your major minerals, again, pause, look at where they, your food sources and their functions. So calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium, potassium, chloride, and sulfur. Those are your major minerals. Take a look and, again, pause and look at them, see what they do, see what they're all part of. And then your trace, iron, zinc, copper, selenium, iodine, manganese, chromium, fluoride, and molybdenum. All right, all of those are really important for, again, making sure that they're compounds that we find in plant and animal based that are important for many different either cellular, bone, muscle, nerve conduction. It really is part of anything. It could be your metabolism, all right? It could be part of growth, all right, depending upon what it is that it is, which minerals or vitamins that you're talking about. And then lastly, to fill out, because remember, we got carbs, fats, proteins, vitamins, and minerals. And then obviously with nutrition, you can't forget water. So water being essential to life. Remember, you can dehydrate and die from dehydration before you can die from starvation. So, just kind of paying attention here. So what are we looking at? Regulation of body temp, transport, and distribution of water-soluble nutrients. Like we said, fiber, vitamins, minerals. Blood volume, so plasma is really important for this. Lubrication of joints, membranes, and synovial tissue. Shock absorption, and then and it helps with obviously waste removal and toxins. So 15 and a half cups or 100, almost a gallon of water a day, because 124 ounces, a gallon is 128, and then 92 ounces or 11 and a half cups per day for women. That's a recommendation. Obviously, there are some factors in there, like me, I live in the state of Florida, so therefore I'm going to need to drink a little bit more water, especially if I'm subjecting myself to the heat. So I'm going to want to have 124 ounces plus whatever else I'm going to have on top of that based on how much I feel like I'm sweating. So again, with inadequate hydration and even mild dehydration, it can cause you to have these things: increased heart rate, higher body temperature, higher RPE or rate of perceived exertion, higher use of muscle glycogen. We're going to use the stored glycogen in our muscles quicker, which is not good. Lower blood volume. So we're talking about lower plasma levels, and which means that your blood is going to become thicker, and therefore when it becomes thicker, it's going to create your body to increase blood pressure. Decreased cardiac output. How much blood is pumped out of your body per minute, or your heart per minute. Decreased blood flow. You have a harder time letting blood flow because your cardiac output is down, even though your heart rate or your blood pressure is up. And then lower rate of perspiration, which is a big component of maintaining a proper body temperature. So and right then and there, all of these just show you right there, that's going to decrease performance, whether it's just general exercise or sports performance. So be aware. How do we monitor? Well, you have your urine chart up there. It's always a good way to do it, right? Anything from 3 and below. But then you got to be very aware too that if you start getting to be where it's see where the 1 is, if it starts to become too clear, now we go and have this problem where we could go into what's called hyponatremia, which means that we're basically having an, even though we're drinking enough, we're basically removing a lot of the electrolytes, particularly sodium, from our body, and therefore we end up having a massive problem with electrolyte balance. And that goes back to this here, where a lot of these factors, on top of becoming dizzy and passing out, can also come into effect. Nausea, vomiting, all that stuff can happen because of that. Now, also too, paying attention to your urine means that you're gonna have to keep getting things back in. But like it says here, during exercise, if you're losing more than 4% of your weight, can lead to things like heat exhaustion, heat stroke, or potentially death if it gets that severe. So what are we saying? It doesn't matter, performance, exercise, all the way up to elite sports performance, it doesn't matter. You cannot go into something dehydrated because it's almost impossible to get yourself to be rehydrated when you're performing. So you have to be aware of that. You gotta be paying attention to the fluid amount that you're drinking per day. That's critical so you don't have these weight losses like they were talking about, therefore not leading to a heat illness. Now, with hydration and sports drinks, it just depends on what, if you're going to be more prolonged, you're going to need to have something that has a little bit more electrolytes and a little bit more carbs in it. All right. Why do we need the electrolytes? For cell balance, cell fluid balance, but also if it has sodium in it, it can help with retaining some fluid so you don't become dehydrated as quickly. All right. So there's your hydration recommendations. Go through those, pay attention to those, and look at them, basically saying, okay, this is what I'm supposed to have the evening prior, the morning of. This is what I'm supposed to have 20 minutes before the start, during, am I supposed to have water? Am I supposed to have a drink? Am I supposed to have tablets, whatever it might be? So just be aware that all these are represented by time frames, so pay attention to those before, right up to, during, and then after post. Okay? So we want to make sure of that. And we follow those hydration recommendations to a T so that we can regain our hydration post-game, post-training. We can be hydrated before to not, disrupt our performance. Very, very critical for that. So what are we talking about here in terms of the sports drinks types? We're talking about hypotonic, isotonic, and hypertonic. Now, like it says here, hypotonic is, typically where we're going to try to get our replacement in, all right? It's a greater priority, like it says here, than carbohydrates or electrolyte replacement. Isotonic, on the other hand, that's more where you're going to be, any of these bases are going to be anything longer than 60 minutes. What you're trying to do is offset the moderate fluid and electrolyte losses and the moderate perspiration. And then for hypertonic, we're talking about high volumes of fluid loss, high electrolyte losses, high perspiration, and we're going to definitely have to try to get carbs and electrolytes replaced. So a hypertonic solution is going to be really more for intense. Isotonic is more for, like your average kind of a training, and hypotonic means that you're just replacing as needed. All right. But no matter what, you always want to make sure of that proper hydration status. So really, hypertonic, you're talking about carb and electrolyte drinks like Gatorade, for example. Isotonic and hypotonic, you can get away with just water. But if you wanted to do a sports drink, for isotonic, you want to dilute it a little bit more or have less of it and have some and then more water on this, with it. All right. And then hypotonic is usually just water in general because carb and electrolyte replacement is really not a great priority there. So with nutrition strategies, though, it's very much dependent upon your BMR, or what is your basal metabolic rate, meaning how many calories do you burn just being at rest. And that's all dependent upon you as a person in terms of how much muscle you have, how much fat you have, how tall you are, how much you weigh, and whether you have this tendency to gain or lose weight. Okay? Now, typically, a lot of things can influence your weight management. We know genetics. Physical activity, energy intake, how much you're eating. Do you have enough sleep? Are you hormonally balanced? Do you have any medications you're taking? Because all of those are going to influence what we call your first law of thermodynamics, where it's energy cannot be created or destroyed but converted from one form to another. So what happens here is we always are, energy in, waste out, and then we're always going under this energy expenditure where you might have to replace. So what is it that we talk about? We have to make sure is our TDEE, which is our total daily energy expenditure. We have to accommodate for what we call NEAT, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So anything that our bodies are doing that's not exercise. And then EAT, which is your exercise activity thermogenesis. Thermogenesis meaning that it's heat that is causing you to burn calories of some way, whether it's exercise or non-exercise. So with our nutrition strategy, we have to take all those things into account, and really non-exercise activity and exercise activity thermogenesis plus your total daily energy expenditure is going to give you how many calories you need to be able to maintain throughout, eat throughout the day. If you're trying to lose weight, it's going to be below that. If you're trying to gain weight, it's going to be above that. If you're trying to maintain, it's going to be really right in between. But just be aware that, again, sleep can really cause a massive problem and disruption in not only hormonal balance, but also contributing to obesity as well. It doesn't mean that just because you eat right and don't sleep well, you're going to gain massive amounts of weight. No, I'm saying that really it can onset, because usually there's other factors that come into play with that. Not just the fact that you're sleeping poorly, but there's a lot of other reasons why you don't sleep. Your eating schedules change. You end up, you could potentially be overeating. It might be that you are eating when you're not supposed to be. So, and a lot of that is hormonal, it can be a hormonal change in you as well. All right. But really with, obesity due to poor sleep, it can be caused by what we call peptide YY, which is your satiety hormone, making you feel full, or ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone, which makes it turn off and on whether you're hungry or not. And all of those, if obesity sets in and your sleep is still not changing, those hormones are going to become more and more out of whack, which means you're going to eat wrong throughout the whole day. Also, endocrine disorders, talking about things like hypothyroidism, where your thyroid does not work correctly, therefore your metabolism is lowered. Cushing's syndrome, where again you have too high of a level of cortisol in your body, and because of that high level of cortisol, it changes how we burn calories and how we eat. And then we have polycystic ovarian syndrome, where like it says here, a hormone disorder that occurs in women of childbearing age that creates basically an irregular period. It creates excess levels of male androgen, and it can create small cysts on the outside edges of your ovaries and then lead to obesity as well. So again, making sure that proper eating, we don't want to have this cause. And then also you can have what's called insulinoma, which is tumors on the pancreas due to the fact that basically the pancreas is working too hard and creating too much insulin because you're eating so much food that requires insulin release. So at any point, if anybody ever comes to you with any of these disorders, you need to refer them out, and you can't handle their nutrition strategies, because that's a medical concern and that's part of your cannots. Okay. Medication, just be aware, medications can throw off hormones. It can throw off how people eat. They can throw off weight management and how people either gain weight or lose weight and they're not even trying. If you've ever been on prednisone before, which is a steroid, you know that it makes you feel like you just are hungry all the time. Had that happen before, but didn't gain any weight because I knew what was going to happen. But it made I felt hungry all the time, and it was just like, why is this happening? And it's because of the steroid, and it makes you feel like you just can eat anything in front of you. So just be aware, medications can really drastically affect that. If you don't eat correctly, again, we talk about it, it can affect your metabolism, either increasing or decreasing it. All right. And then we have what's called adaptive thermogenesis, where our body makes adaptations to us ever changing and how much energy expenditure we are going through. So if a person starts working out, their energy expenditure goes up, then your body is going to naturally adapt to how we can, we have to adjust our eating. If you're having inability to lose weight, this is one of the reasons why, is because your body is not adapting to not moving, and so that can become a problem. So we have to be very aware at what's going on, and we have to adapt to it because our bodies don't want to. Okay, our bodies want to stay what they're doing and run the course. And if you start gaining weight, it wants to eat for what you are. So you gain 50 pounds, and your body needs more calories. It just can't live off of the lesser calories that you normally have. So just be aware that that can also happen. Food labels, making sure that you're paying attention to these as much as possible. Me personally, I am an advocate of making sure you check the ingredients, which aren't on this food label, but you want to make sure that they're there. Okay. Some things to check on. If you notice underneath total fat, it says saturated fat. A lot of times you'll see or you'll see monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. You might see EPA, DHA, which are those omegas that are found in things like fish oil. So those might be on there as well if you're eating fish. So check and see, make sure everything is healthy as it possibly can. And then the other thing to pay attention to is the carbs with the dietary fiber. If you're a person who, like, just say you're working with a diabetic person and they were put on, you didn't put them on, but they were put on by a doctor or a dietitian, a low carb diet, we want to check the total carbs, subtract the amount of dietary fiber from it, and understand that that's net carbs. And then the lower the net carbs can sometimes be more beneficial for a diabetic who's trying to control their blood sugar. So just kind of some food for thought. Everything else I know you kind of are aware of, but just read, sodium, just be aware sodium is always on there. Always. We want to stay within our realm of sodium. Sometimes we have to have a little bit more, especially if we are a person who is a heavy perspirer or a heavy sweater, just sweats a lot. But always check. And then obviously your serving sizes are really critical as well. Eat the whole thing on the left-hand side, and you're going to have 8 servings of that whole container, and you're going to have to multiply all of that by 8. So that's pretty scary. Kind of just talked about a lot of these key considerations, but, again, pause here, take a look, see what the considerations are, and go from there. Again, total carbs, everything there. So I don't really pay attention to the percentage of daily value, because that means that everybody should be on a 2,000 calorie diet. I don't dig that, because some people shouldn't be on it. Like, if you have a 100-pound female who's trying to gain some weight, she probably shouldn't be on a 2,000 calorie diet, but she probably should be higher than what she's expecting. But so we can't always go off of what the percentage of daily value is. We just want to make sure our macros and our micros are fitting in the right area. And then, there's a little bit of a difference, just kind of showing you what the difference between the US versus the UK food labels are. Just be aware that there are some subtle differences, that you might see in Europe versus here. Interestingly enough, one of the things I love about this, though, is the fact that they have the percentage of ingredient that's there. It says right there, mandarin oranges make up 37.9% of what it is. That's awesome. That's a great thing. So just kind of, just a little bit of a subtle difference there. Color coding. Again, this is more European than it is here, but understand this is how they color code. I think this is amazing, because it tells you the different colors and whether it's high, medium, or low, which is great. And then, again, with fat loss strategies, we're always trying to make sure we pay attention to our total daily energy expenditure and know, okay, if we're trying to lose weight or try to lose fat, we need to minimize the amount of calories we eat, but we have to modify modify our energy, but we're going to choose things that are going to help us to get fuller quicker, but not overeat in terms of the amount of calories. And then on top of that, we want to make sure that not only are we dieting, but we're also burning calories, meaning we're going to need to move more and exercise more. Remember, they're two different things. Moving more, just say that you don't have a lot of time at work, but at least you can get up every so often and move around. That's neat. And then getting to and training and working out, that's your eat. Okay? But remember, always working on making sure that our protein is always adequate depending upon our fat loss. So here's a lot of strategies that you can work with. Very important to kind of, figure out what it is that's going to work, because it may work for one person, but it may not work for another. So there's plenty of options here for everybody. Muscle gaining, this is where we're going to have to increase our protein, probably going to have to increase our carb range, and keep our fats the same. But typically we want to make sure that we're getting more calories than what our body needs. But again, making higher quality choices, because we don't want to have that processed base. Portion sizes and meal timing, obviously everything is varied, but what do we have 3 meals a day? Do we have 5 meals a day? It ultimately, really, if 4 to 7 meals is always like a good window, depending upon you as a person. But just remember that, there's always these windows of time that we want to eat, especially post exercise. But remember, the old advent used to be, you make sure you eat as soon as you can after training, and then it's like up to 60 minutes. Well, it doesn't have to be directly after anymore. It's just, we want to still make sure we get in our food post training to help with recovery, but it can be outlasting as long as 24 to 48 hours now for our protein, for a muscle protein synthesis to rebuild muscle. But understand that, it may not be that long. It could be a couple of hours. So it doesn't have to be right after like the old, adage used to be. Performance strategies, take a look at these, see where your protein numbers are, your carb numbers are, your fluid, proper sleeping. So this is always really important to, it might give you some nutrient timing strategies here that can help you to make sure that you're eating at the right times in the right amounts. Especially when it comes to performance, and especially if it's like not a training session, but an actual competition. And that's that. So, again, just be aware. We got to be very careful of what we can and cannot do. All right? Cannot give plans, but we have ideas and recommendations of what's out there. We can supply people with information, but we cannot give them a meal 1 is chicken, rice, and broccoli. So you can't do those things, but we can give them strategies to help them. So again, the line is very blurred, but we don't want to make the line blurry. We want to make the line very, very crisp. So we know that if it's something that we know a dietitian is supposed to do, we're not doing it. Okay? We don't want to get ourselves into any liability concerns over nutrition when our job is to work on the performance. All right? But it doesn't mean that we don't have, again, as long as we're not contradicting anybody, we want to make sure we still have this information in our brain in case someone asks us a question that we can give them a response to without making that line blurry. All right? So this is chapter 9, that nutrition base. Like I said, we don't normally teach this during we have a separate course that we teach for my university, but I'm so happy that I can actually get this together and give this all to you guys. So enjoy, pause and stop, look at everything, and take your time with this one, because this is a very dedicated chapter to what you all are going to have when it comes to your test. All right. Have a great day. Like I said, if you have any questions, follow me. I'm on Instagram. I'm Dr. Jeff Williams. With a bunch of underscores. I'm actually the Exercise Science Institute. You can always ask me a question there, or just send me an email based on the links that you see inside of the video. All right. Have a great day, and hopefully you'll find some more videos to be just as wealthy here. So take care.